Okay, I want to thank Maya for inviting me here to talk about our practice. I think it was kind of just dawned on me that I was here literally the last time I lectured here, other than as a teacher, was 2011. I lectured for a tenure track position, which was which was literally the first thing I did when we moved to Toronto. Actually, I applied for that right before we moved to Toronto. So my name is Andrew Batay Csorba. I am one of the founding partners of Batay Csorba Architects. We did start in 2010, and the Batay Csorba Architects is a partnership between me and my wife, Jody. And it's a partnership that we started very early on. So we met the first week of undergrad school, the first weekend, and have literally been working since then. So we did several projects during our undergrad. We both went to UCLA in Los Angeles for grad school and worked together through then. And then we took some separate paths kind of outside of that. I worked for Morphosis Architects for 5 years as a lead project designer. And my task was pretty much the kind of front-end design of projects along with a whole slew of competitions. So during my time there, I worked on like 20-plus projects, some of which got built. My wife, on the other hand, had a very kind of varying path when we left grad school. She worked at a few different places, Frank Gehry, Gensler, and she had the kind of opposite trajectory, and she worked a lot on the documentation, project management. So we kind of had both the front end and back end. We always knew we were going to start an office. It was always kind of when for us and where. So in 2010, just by coincidence, the projects that we had been working on at our offices finished. And there was a kind of moment where we could make kind of both could make a clean getaway from our offices. And so at that time, we decided to kind of jump in and do the office. And that kind of led us to Toronto, which was a kind of weird route for us, seeing as we had never lived in Toronto before. We didn't have any work here. We didn't even have a place to live. We had no connections, no clients, and no colleagues. So we thought that would be a perfect place to start an office. And we just kind of jumped into it and went for it, which is something that I'd say we kind of do a lot. Whether that turns out good or bad, I think in the long run it's turned out. It may be difficult in the short term. But now we are an office of 5. So I think that the first thing when we started an office was trying to figure out which trajectory, and I'll describe kind of like, obviously I was thinking about teaching, and I was teaching here. I did something at Waterloo, at U of T, and then Jody was running the practice when I was teaching, and we kind of did that for a few years, and we decided that we had to kind of pick a team. And so eventually we ended up just kind of focusing on our practice. And how we started. So we kind of, through our education and places we worked at, kind of offices started in 2 different ways. So you went and you taught and you did some competitions on the side, which were like big international competitions, and you try to win one. So that was kind of one trajectory. The other trajectory was you start, even though you have experience in larger projects from previous work, you start at the bottom, doing kind of small renos, and then try to work your way up to kind of a substantial body of work. We didn't like either of those. And we had started, I would say, in the teaching competition realm at the very beginning. And I should probably start flipping through these. And we ended up doing 2 competitions where we had kind of so-so success. And then at that point, we decided to kind of take a strategic position on the research that we do in the office. So we decided to do a series of research projects instead of competitions that looked at a kind of specific typology in Toronto. It was a low-rise housing typology. And kind of since then, we've developed, still a series of speculative projects, but up to 8 of these projects, built and non-built in the city. And so one of the things that, one of the best pieces of information I received when I was at grad school was from the Dean of SciArc, Hernan, Alonso Diaz. And he mentioned in one of his lectures that it didn't really matter what you do in your practice or what you're interested in, but as long as those interests become an obsession. And I think that was really important for us at the very beginning in trying to find our own voice. Because we had worked at these places that had very specific ideologies, positions, geometry, like everything was very defined. And so for us, the process of starting practice was really trying to shed what we had done and what was so kind of innately plugged into us at these places. We had to shed that and develop our own obsessions. And so when we started kind of looking at, we were fascinated by the city, I think, because we hadn't spent much time other than when we were kids. We were fascinated with the low-rise housing typology and kind of like specifically the duplex house. We thought it was a kind of fascinating phenomenon, and we're wondering why people weren't kind of spending more time researching or doing research or projects related to the residential fabric of Toronto. And so we saw, everybody was doing massive high-rises, mid-rises, and there was a lot of discussion around that, but not so much how a kind of incremental urbanism would happen on the low-rise scale. So we kind of jumped into that, and we thought that would be a way for us to easily transition. And so one of the first projects we got was a 7-unit townhouse building. And so it was an easy one for us to kind of get work in, although the work that's development work, which is a whole kind of other game of work, which kind of brings in a whole other level of non-architectural issues. So when we kind of first started, one of the things that we were very interested in or cognizant about was finding and creating a series of positions or a certain framework that the office would then work within. During our time at UCLA, there was a huge focus on the critical project as a means of working. And so that kind of stuck with us. And so it stuck with us to the point where even though we are working on a development project, we can still be critical about certain aspects within the overall architecture discourse so that our office isn't just a purely service office. We provide the service and we're engaged at every level of that, but we also take the time to kind of infuse our projects with a level of kind of criticality on any number of issues within the profession. And I think that kind of plethora, developing an idea of having multiple positions on various things is something that kind of stuck with us and has allowed us, I think, the flexibility of taking on drastically different programs. And so to kind of quickly go through some of those. So this was our example of shedding our previous self to kind of find a new voice. So we literally did these 2 or 3 projects, and did like 1,000 options. And every option, we'd take a look at it and we'd be like, no, this is too much. This is too much Tom Main. Get rid of it. Junk. This is too much this person, too much that person. And we literally struggled for 2 years doing this. A kind of horrible time, but a time that kind of led us to where we are today, and to a kind of series of positions that we feel kind of very strongly about. And so when we started, we kind of started to, these are just a series of them. I'm not going to dwell too much on them because I'd like to show some of the work we do. So LowRise Development, we had Barton Myers as a teacher when we were at UCLA. And so coming here in Toronto, then understanding his past and the kind of social activism that went into a lot of the early work in the laneway studies was something that we were really interested in, that position and the agency that an architect has within the city and the profession to kind of instigate movement. And so the low rise for us became an avenue. Context. So I think coming from the initial studies we did of the semi-detached house, which we're still just surprised of to this day, we started to understand kind of trying to move the discussion of context from one of semiotics to one of massing, one of geometry. That would allow us to build in these highly regulated neighborhoods in Toronto. Typological reconfiguration. So this was actually one of the first houses that we saw. And to this day, this house is kind of the genesis of a lot of our work. And we're fascinated by the window in the middle. And like still to this day, we ended up buying a house after we had saw this house years before we were architects in Toronto, came back and we lived right down the street. We still don't know what that is, but for us, what the possibility of that alludes to is that you could have a separation of the kind of contextual facade from the inner spatial organization of a low-rise house. And so we have spent a lot of time kind of confronting the typical narrow, deep Toronto site and how that has kind of handcuffed, I would say, a lot of the development in the city to a kind of very rigid series of spaces, organizations, so on and so forth. Activated facades. So I literally had not designed a facade until we started our own office at Morphosis. It was something that we just didn't do. Tom always wanted to dematerialize the facade, so the facades were always perf. And it didn't matter whatever it was just the whole building was one thing and that was it. So we were really interested in exploring facade as a kind of material exploration, but something that was geared towards the public realm. So in that we were really interested in kind of using the building as a means to engage the public and their perception as they move in and around the building. Landscape. So this is one of our favorite kind of pieces by Park Harrison, but we were again going back to the kind of residential and the position that landscape plays within the structure of a residential domain in Toronto was something very interesting to us and something we perceived as being incredibly synthetic already and not being a kind of romanticized notion of unbridled nature as some would believe it was. And so understanding as synthetic allowed us to really play with this idea of how to bring the outside into the building. Okay, first project. How am I doing time-wise? That's 5 minutes left? What? Oh, jeez. Really? That was supposed to be 5 minutes at the beginning. My wife always stops me from rambling on. Okay, so first project is double duplex. So this is a development project. We've had the weird relationship with our developers that we've worked with. They're first-time developers. So this husband and wife team owned a bar on Ossington, sold the bar, and decided they wanted to develop a building. So we looked at several sites in the city, and they decided they had this one in Parkdale. And so on the site previous to ours was a very small, kind of out-of-scale residential building, and it sat on a double-wide site. So if anybody, I'm sure we're all familiar with some of the Parkdale neighborhood, it's kind of lined with these beautiful Victorian, Edwardian mansions with, you know, beautiful tree-lined streets. And so they decided to take on this idea of producing 2 duplexes for their first development project. So this consists of 4 stories. We're kind of counting the lower level as a story, and I'll show you in the section. 3,500 square feet each house, and each house is divided by upper and lower. Is there a laser on this? Nope. 2 stories upper unit, 2 stories lower unit. So we started by kind of abstracting typology and the topology of the pervasive bay and gable house. And so we translated certain abstractions that we developed into the project. So the 2-story brise-soleil wood facade becomes this kind of vertical element of the bay windows. The side roofs now mimic the side roofs on the other houses and connect up to certain datums. And then the use of a kind of neighborhood brick. And so the big thing for us on this project was how to take a development project and put it in a neighborhood where it could stand up to the level of craft that you see in some of these masonry coursing details that are images from and around the neighborhood. So we had a really hard time figuring out how we were going to translate that notion, 19th century craft, into a development project. And so we started to look at the wood screen. And so the wood screen ended up, through massing, provided us this amazing surface area. So we started to think, okay, is there a way that we can embed something in the screen so that we can play a game with the neighborhood? It's a great neighborhood to walk, a ton of people on the streets. And so we were like, well, maybe that is going to be the public portion of this project that is going to interact with the neighborhood in the way that a kind of porch culture would. And so we decided to choose a game. It was cloud watching. So cloud watching, the children's game, projecting abstract geometry on cloud figures. And so we were also interested in a game that would work with the seasons, would work with people moving back and forth. And so how we did this, so we had 2 main elements in the screen, vertical elements and the horizontals. We did 2 different horizontals. There are 2 angles, and we used them both front and back. We outlined a series of animal figures. So we had a giraffe, raccoon, a crocodile, panther, and a camel. And so the idea was, you can see here on the left is a kind of lighting example we did to show the camel. We were very conscious of not to get into the realm of kitsch, so that people would have to, in a way, know or be aware of the game to play it. So what we were interested in is that, and how the screen was designed, is that during certain times of the year and during certain times of day, portions of the animals reveal themselves. And so what it has literally produced is a bunch of people standing in front of that house, kind of gawking at the screens, trying to see stuff. We are trying to produce a iPhone app, kind of similar to the Constellation app, that would tell you when these things become evident and allow you to kind of draw in your own and upload them. Fabrication. So one of the things that we have had to do to build these projects is do a significant amount of design build. So, and we kind of utilize as much digital fabrication as we can. And we design these things and produce kind of, we call them like IKEA-like documents, that if we have to build them, we'll do it ourselves. And so this was built by a crew of 4 people. One was a furniture designer, and 3 others were neighbors in the neighborhood, one of which was a DJ, and the other 2 were unemployed at the time. And they literally built these in the living room, and it was, we kind of had a series of these panels. 6 made the facade. They built them in the living room, hoisted them up with some climbing gear, and bolted them in. So this is at night. So at day becomes the game, at night becomes glowing from inside, becomes a kind of a jack-o'-lantern. So internally, am I too long here? I'll be done in a little bit. Internally, we tried to, the first thing was how to make the actual 2 units work with the basement. So we carved out the front and back, pulled in the walls on the first floor and produced double height glazing, which allowed us to bring a massive amount of natural light. In the upper unit, we have a kind of central light well, and then the front brise-soleil. Plans. And so this example of the kind of the quality of light that comes in. Our client wanted it to be like a rugged loft, so we had to use, or we only could afford kind of off-the-shelf Home Depot floor joists that were extremely rugged and gnarly. So we ended up taking that and taking the fact that they were cheap, or cheaper, and taking the structural blocking that was necessary and multiplying that through the ceiling, in a way kind of producing a texture that would bring the texture from the facade inside, but kind of taking your eye away from the specific quality of each of them. We had a graffiti artist in the back do something, and then these are kind of one of the drawings that we do for all our projects. They're kind of like a child's chain doll. And it kind of experimentation allows us to see both a kind of planimetric, sectional, and spatial relationships all in one drawing. Okay, I'm done. This is just